Um, I'm happy to be able to talk about my book based on my grandfather's diaries of growing up in Russian occupied Poland in the early 1900s. But it also occurred to me, the book is really relevant right now because a lot of what we can learn from it is about resilience in the face of really dire circumstances, which, we're clearly experiencing now. So I think in talking this through, you'll see what I mean. So now I grew up hearing stories about a grandfather that I never got to meet because he passed away well before I was born. I knew he had been sentenced to death multiple times in the early 1900s in Russia, but to hear my mother tell some of his stories of his adventures and misadventures, he sounded more like a cross between Maxwell Smart and Bart Simpson. He was daring and impulsive and completely unconcerned with consequences. And if he were alive today, he'd probably be diagnosed with ADHD. But he was also a man who stood up for what he believed in despite the circumstances and looked out for his friends regardless of the risks to himself. But mostly, he had a sense of humor about his circumstances that made it possible for him to survive and help other people survive. So to explain what I learned about my grandfather in this process, I need to start at the end of a story that might not have had me in it. And that is the occasion over 100 years ago of my grandfather's third death sentence. As a soldier and later an officer in the Russian army during the Russo-Japanese War, Jacob Maritek was horrified to see so many young lives being squandered. And he vowed at the gravesites of so many of his friends to see to it that the Tsar could never do that again. So after the war and the escape from Siberia and so on, he joined the Polish Revolutionary Underground movement that sought to overthrow the Tsar. And in one of their poorly planned operations, he was caught, arrested, and in less time than it takes to sneeze, casually sentenced to death in 3 days. So as he was being led through the streets of Warsaw in chains on the way to the notorious Citadel prison where prisoners were kept before their execution, he happened to see a young girl getting off the train and thought that she had sympathetic eyes. So he let her see him drop a note from between his chained palms, hoping that she would pick it up, follow the instructions to save him. But the next instant, the chain yanked him forward and he suspected that the prisoner behind him probably ground the note into the mud with his boots and thought that she wouldn't be able to help him. And he didn't realize that she had done something until the day before his execution, when he was notified that his sentence had suddenly been changed to merely 10 years of hard labor in Siberia, followed by permanent exile. Now that was known as getting a tenor in Russia at the time, and it was the equivalent of being declared not guilty. Now, you would think that Jacob would have been grateful for such a lenient sentence, but no, he had the chutzpah to escape from Siberia and traveled 3,000 miles from Warsaw back to, travel 3,000 miles from here. He was in Mukden where the fighting was happening. Irkutsk is a town in Siberia. I think the prison camp he escaped from was closer to Tomsk. So he traveled 3,000 miles back to Warsaw, where he wanted to find the young girl who had saved his life. So he got back to Warsaw, burst into his brother's apartment, and immediately without even explaining how he got there, said, what's the name of the young girl who had saved his life? And my grandfather's older brother said, you know, I didn't think it was that important to find out where to send a thank you note when we had only 2 days to save your life. And my grandfather and his brother were arguing with each other about whose responsibility it was. When they finally stopped and took a breath, my grandfather's sister-in-law said that she remembered certain details. She remembered that the girl had come from a nearby town of Novi Dvor, which is in modern day Belarus, and that she had come to Warsaw to visit a cousin of hers whose name was Golda or Gilda, and she thought she was a hairdresser or something, but she remembered that the woman lived at a particular intersection in Warsaw. So my grandfather tore out of that apartment and went to that intersection and knocked on every single door on every floor of every building at that intersection until he found a woman named Gutta, the wig maker, who said that, yes, she had, several years before, she had been visited by a cousin who carried with her this crazy note, and they were debating what to do about it. So, but he did get the name of the girl. And when he went back to his relatives and told them the girl's name and said he wanted to meet her, they said, oh, you can't meet her. She's far too good for you. Her father was a Hasidic rabbi, and she had already been offered the best matches with Talmudic scholars in the area, most of which, or all of which, she had turned down, some of whom had turned her down because she insisted on being able to read secular books in multiple languages. But even though she was at the advanced age of 16, her father was not by any means going to let her meet someone who was not only not a Talmudic scholar, but was a yeshiva dropout and an ex-con to boot. So when Jacob's relatives saw how disappointed he was at not being able to meet the girl, they somehow manipulated an accidental meeting between the two. And after speaking with a couple of hours, they decided to marry. Well, her name was Bryna, and that's who I was named for. So when I started working on this book, I realized that somehow in the back of my mind, I'd always known that I would be the one to finally be able to tell my grandfather's story. When I started working on the book, one of the things that I wondered about and wanted to explain through the book was, first of all, who was this man who lived every day as if it were his last, which at least 3 of them were supposed to have been? And also, how come he didn't learn his lesson from his first death sentence? So Jacob was born in 1881 in the town of Visegrad, which is, here's Novi Dvor and here's Visegrad. This was a town that was founded 500 years earlier and still exists today, but is known for absolutely nothing special about the town. But this was a time when everyone in the town and in the area was starving. So it was pretty typical for parents to send their kids out into the world around the age of 12 or 13 to make their own way in the world. And for boys, there were 2 options. There was either go to yeshiva to learn, which for the Orthodox was the only profession that really mattered, or find a job and help support the family. Well, Jacob freely admitted he was not a fan of hard work, and he thought the idea of sitting and learning all day sounded like a pretty pleasant way of spending his time. So he opted to follow one of his older brothers named Chaim to the nearby town of Plak to study in yeshiva. But Chaim was a very considerate son, So when he wrote letters to his parents, he didn't bother to tell them that everyone in Plock was starving too, and that the only way the boys were being fed was because somebody shamed the householders into feeding one boy 1 day a week. But since everyone was starving, it was not unusual for the householders to either run out of food before the boy showed up or simply to forget to save some for him. So Jacob thought, well, starving I can do from the comfort of home. So he decided to run away from yeshiva after less than a week. And being only 12 years old, he didn't even think about telling anyone that he was leaving. But the yeshiva discovered that he was missing and reported that to the police. And in what may have been one of the early sources of a Polish joke, the police had around the same time discovered that someone had drowned in the river. Unclear whether it was a boy of 12 or an older man or woman, but they decided, we've got a missing boy, we've got a dead body, we'll wipe our hands of both of them by solving them both at the same time. So they reported Jacob's death to his parents, who sat Shiva for him for the first, but definitely not the last time. And in fact, it took Jacob a full week to get home because he was not eager to see his father's face when he revealed that he had given up on the life of the mind. So now that he'd washed out of yeshiva, his only option was to get a job. And Jacob desperately wanted to get out of Visegrad, where he said in oddly contemporary terms that he was bored to death of Visegrad and he needed to get to a big city. So he left for his parents. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have switched yet. So, but his father, knowing how impulsive Jacob was, thought that it might not be a good idea for a 12-year-old boy to be let loose in the big city. So he found for him a whole series of apprenticeships with tradespeople in Visegrad so Jacob could learn a profession. Why a whole series? Because not one of the jobs lasted even a week. Some didn't even last a day before someone was screaming at Jacob and predicting that he'd end up before a firing squad before too long. But after he'd failed at everything that could possibly be done in Visegrad, his father agreed to let him head off to the big city of Warsaw. But at least he had another older brother in Warsaw, Mordechai, who had the responsible job of a baker. Now, to Jacob, the idea of working around food sounded fantastic to someone who'd been starving. But what he didn't know, because Mordechai didn't mention this to their parents in his letters home, was that bakers' hours were 20 to 22 hours a day, 6 days a week, with only the Sabbath off for rest. And having watched out of everything else and not even having any money to go home with his tail between his legs, Jacob had to work under those same conditions too. And he developed sympathy for all the oppressed workers and in fact organized the first strike in Warsaw for actually shorter working hours. He and all the workers wanted their hours reduced from 132 hours a week to 72 hours a week. So it shouldn't be surprising that the strike failed, not only because the demands were so significant, but also because all of the business owners were also working 20 to 22 hours a day, 6 days a week. So the strike failed, but it did bring Jacob into contact with the local police, who beat him up fairly regularly and threw him in jail a few times. But there was really nothing else he could do to change his circumstances, because he knew at the age of 21, he was going to be conscripted into the Russian army. And that was a particularly bad place for a Jew to be. Anti-Semitism was the official government policy, and it was the police and the army who were in charge of carrying out those pogroms on a regular basis, just to keep Jews in their place. So most Jews with any common sense found a way out. And I'll read a short excerpt about how they did that. For the rich, there was no problem. They bought their way out. For the poor, however, there was only one avenue of escape: self-mutilation. And since there were any number of equally frightful possibilities to choose from, long evenings of consultation took place. My Aunt Sylvia strongly recommended a man who would draw out all of my teeth. Fibish, the bath attendant, held that the surest remedy would be for me to blind myself in my right eye, without which one cannot aim a rifle. And my Uncle Yona, never at a loss, knew a man skilled in the art of severing a tendon at the knee. Had I accepted even half the suggestions offered to me, I should not only have escaped military service, but would have ended up a cripple, such as the world had never seen. So Jacob turned down the self-mutilation option, but it was not really out of a sense of pride. He still wanted to have an opportunity for great adventure, and thought in the army he might be able to have some excitement and earn some medals before he had to put the humdrum remainder of his life into some matchmaker's hands. And he definitely found adventure. In fact, it was practically his first day in the army when Jacob's commanding officer referred to him with a term of endearment that was very common at the time: Żydowska morda, which means Jew face or Jew snout. Now, that was no different from how everyone referred to Jews at the time, but for some reason, on that occasion, Jacob overreacted, and he hit his commanding officer over the head with what he had in his hand at the time, which was an iron tea kettle filled with steaming water. So you can imagine that was a death sentence worthy offense. Now, I was going to ask if you happen to be familiar with the phrase "Hakmir Nishken Chainik." It's one of the few Yiddish phrases that I learned in childhood because it means stop nagging. So yeah, that's what I heard a lot. But the literal definition is "don't hit me over the head with a tea kettle." So I like to think that my grandfather was the origin of that phrase. Anyway, after his first death sentence, it wasn't long before the Russo-Japanese War began. Now, that was a war ostensibly fought over a warm weather port called Port Arthur that was important for Russia to be able to get food and other supplies during their winters. But it also had strategic importance for the Japanese to protect themselves from Russia. But the real reason for the war was that the Tsar had been hearing rumblings about revolution. And in fact, there was a first Russian Revolution in 1905. And he thought that a quick and easy war would stir up all this patriotic fervor and make everybody forget all this nonsense about revolution. So Russia provoked Japan to attack by violating terms of an earlier treaty. And then once Japan attacked, Russia declared war. But considering that Russia had declared war, what was really remarkable is that Russia was completely unprepared for war. They hadn't kept up on military technology for the last 30 years since the Russo-Turkish War. They also had not made any arrangements for the soldiers to have warm clothing or boots to survive a winter in Manchuria. And on the rare occasions when the men received food, it was described as a soup that tasted like the cook had washed his laundry in it, with a piece of meat floating on top that had been too tough to make into boots. But even worse than the lack of planning was the complete and total incompetence of the Army. They provided weapons to only some of the soldiers, but ammunition to other soldiers. So the only way to have them both at the same time was to scavenge off the bodies of their dead comrades. Then there was one of my grandfather's officers, a General Zasulich, who couldn't read a map. And he actually had to have the train stop in Manchuria to ask the peasants, which way is the war? Which, as my grandfather noted, gave some of them a few more weeks to live. So Tsar Nicholas kept the war going long after it had clearly been lost and the generals had all abandoned their soldiers. And the Japanese seemed prepared to push the Russians all the way back to Petersburg. So it was on an occasion after Jacob and his troops had spent 2 weeks on the retreat from the Japanese and hadn't gotten any sleep, that they finally found where several battalions of soldiers were bivouacked, not very strategically at the bottom of a valley. So, you know, the Japanese would be very easy to attack them. My grandfather argued with the commanding officer that it didn't make sense to put people who had not had any sleep for the last 2 weeks on guard duty because there's a risk they would fall asleep. And if they did, the whole camp would be vulnerable. But the commanding officer said, well, if I put you and 4 Jews on watch and you all get killed, well, that's 5 less of you for me to worry about after the war. Mm. And indeed, Jacob did fall asleep and had his rifle stolen. Now, each of those offenses are also death penalty offenses. So I had grown up hearing that my grandfather had been sentenced to death 4 times. And while I was working on the book, I kept counting. I wasn't coming up with 4 death sentences. And it turned out that because one death sentence was for falling asleep and another one was for losing his rifle, as my grandfather said, they couldn't kill him twice on the same day. So that's why I describe it as just 3 death sentences, but otherwise it was known as 4. So any event, after all of this and after his escapes and all the stories he had to tell, the question is, why has it taken over 100 years to share these remarkable stories? Well, in 1905, the Russo-Japanese War was 1904-1905, and we think it was 1905 when Jacob first began recording all of these stories of how the Tsar had let down his own people. And I think I'm missing a slide here. I guess I'll come back to it later. It probably got out of order. But in any event, he started keeping a diary during the Russo-Japanese War, but was distracted occasionally by the need to survive and then to escape from Siberia. And he didn't finish writing during the war. And in fact, after escaping from Siberia and then escaping to the United States, he used to tell the stories that later became the book to any of his Polish-speaking comrades. And they always urged him to write them down and publish them because he retold the stories with the same sense of humor and irony and optimism that you'll see in the book. But he just didn't have time. In fact, he didn't have time to start writing until the Depression. And then he sat down and started recounting all of these incidents and stories that he had been telling people for years. And he didn't stop writing for the next 20 years. By then, he had filled 28 notebooks with stories of growing up in Russian-occupied Poland and then going to war and escaping and so on. And in 1950, he finally felt that he was done. He had recorded all of the stories that he'd been telling for years. And he asked my mother, who was his youngest child, if she would help him translate them, because he wrote primarily in Yiddish, but with a little bit of Russian and Polish thrown in. And my mother was thrilled because her entire upbringing, every Sunday, my grandfather would read to his children the stories he had written that week. And it was her fondest memories of childhood. So she said, well, of course, we'll start tomorrow when I get home from work. But then what happened is something that only happens in the movies. And my grandfather passed away that very night. So nothing more was thought about the diaries for a number of years until my mother was dating my father, who later became the first Orthodox writer in Hollywood. He was from Germany and was fluent in Yiddish. So when my mother brought him to the hospital to meet her mother towards the end of her life, my grandmother said to my mother, show him Papa's diaries. And then in good Jewish mother fashion, she added to my mother, and tell him not to wear that scarf with that coat. So my mother shared the diaries with my father, and he too was absolutely enthralled by this incredible tone of humor and optimism, despite the circumstances that he was describing. And after my parents married, they spent between years and decades translating the 28 notebooks, because Yiddish is hard to translate into English. A lot of the phrases lose their flavor. And what was particularly important was that they maintained my grandfather's voice, his unique way of telling stories. So finally, in about 1975, my parents were able to publish the stories from the first 12 of the 28 notebooks under the title, The Samurai of Visegrad. My father always intended to tell the remaining stories, but he too passed away before he could finish that task. So about 10 years ago, when both of my brothers and I were visiting my mother in LA, she made it clear that she wanted to see her father's stories told during her lifetime. So by this point, I'd already inherited 2 generations of guilt, and I didn't want to pass it on to my kids too. So I said I would do it. But I didn't want to create a volume 2 to a volume 1 that had been published 35 years earlier. So I wanted to answer both for myself and the reader, what kind of person needs to be sentenced to death more than once to catch on that he's doing the wrong thing. So I went back to the first book and summarized details from my grandfather's upbringing that showed how he formed his worldview and what made him the kind of person that he was, and then continued into the events that continued after the first 12 notebooks, all of it draped over the theme of the 3 death sentences, because that was what always interested people. And when I finished, I flashed back to something in 8th grade, which was having to do book reports where you were always asked, what are the themes of this book? And I realized I hadn't focused on putting any themes into the book. I was just trying to identify, who my grandfather was. But as I thought about it, I realized that there definitely were a certain number of themes in this book. One of them is that history repeats itself. As I was working on this during the Arab Spring, and it showed us that whenever people are oppressed politically, economically, and socially, they tend to revolt. So that's what was happening in Russia, that was happening in the Arab countries, and that happens repeatedly throughout history. Another lesson is that hate is not a survival skill. Throughout the war, my grandfather was surrounded by both commanding officers and even his own soldiers who repeatedly vowed to see to it that my grandfather would not survive the war. And yet, when people were injured in battle, my grandfather would pick them up and carry them to safety, even if they had been the very same people who vowed to kill him an hour or two before. The other comes from my great-grandfather's final words to Jacob as he saw him off to war. He said, "Be a Jew," which means literally, of course, maintain your identity, because so many people who went off to war came back years later thoroughly brutalized and without any sense of Yiddishkeit. So Jacob not only never hid his identity, he was proud of it, which also got him in trouble. But the other message is that you need to be a mensch before you can be a good Jew. There are so many people who claim they are good Jews, good Christians, good Muslims, but they're not good human beings. And being a good human being really has to come before you consider yourself a good religious person. But then there was something else that occurred to me. Oh, here's an out of order slide. This is my grandfather's name. He had pasted articles from local newspapers into his diaries. And I don't even remember which one this was. There are pictures of the Tsar and the Tsarina in the diaries because it was required that every barracks had pictures of the Tsar and Tsarina in their barracks, and they were supposed to kiss the Tsarina's picture every day. So anyway, he included some of those in his diaries. And I think I have a picture of all the notebooks. Yeah, he filled up 28 of those composition notebooks by the time he was done. So I don't know why this is out of order. Yes. But another lesson that I thought became very clear from the book is, of course, none of us can control the circumstances of our lives, just as we can't control this pandemic. But what determines who we are is how we respond to the circumstances. Whether we keep claiming it's not real, everything's going to go back to normal, or, you know what, this is what we've got to deal with, and we'll find a way to deal with it. Now, Jacob had many reasons to despair during the war, but his humor kept him going, except on one occasion. At one point, it was just all too much. And he said, you know what, I'm just going to kill myself, which I think a lot of people would have said in the context of this war was an irrational choice. But on that occasion, one of his friends saved him. A friend from his hometown said, why would you want to kill yourself here in Siberia and be buried where no one's ever going to know where you are? Why don't we wait until we get to a nice sized town that has a Jewish cemetery? And you know what? If it looks nice enough, maybe I'll kill myself with you. So he was able to joke Jacob out of his desperation on that occasion. And that was how they kept each other alive. But if I had the chance to ask my grandfather what he meant to impart or what message he intended to leave in his diaries, he would have said, well, there's no message. After all, he passed away after he'd written only a first draft. All he wanted to do was make people laugh. So by inviting me here today to speak, Melanie, and to thank you for being here, I got to spend another 40 minutes thinking about my grandmother, my grandfather, and being close to him that way. And my grandfather would be happy that maybe he's helped you laugh a little bit 70 years after his death. So now I'm happy to answer any questions you have or suggest questions. And I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but the only one who can ask questions.
Thank you so much, Brian. I definitely had moments of laughter. So So where did he and you get some of these? I know you said some of them were cutouts from the newspaper, but like the bakery scene, was that an actual scene of him at the bakery? How did?
No, those, I went to Wikimedia Commons for pictures from certain eras, like the yeshiva and the bakery and things like that. Yeah, there actually were only two extant photographs of my grandfather, one of him in his army uniform and one of him as an old man. Nothing else survived. It's amazing that the diaries survived,
Yeah,
considering that he had been through war and escaped from Siberia with him. But we do have all of those notebooks.
incredible.
So, I brought up some discussion questions about why did he begin keeping a diary? And as I mentioned, one of the reasons was he was keeping track of the many ways that the Tsar had let down his own people. Not being prepared for war militarily, strategically, with clothing, with food, with ammunition, and all of those things. But also he was really keeping a contemporaneous document of what his life was like during the war. And all the other people in his troop knew that if he were killed, which he fully expected to be during the war, the diary was supposed to go to his parents. So I guess it would have been a way for them to feel closer to him during this period of time.
Amazing. John, have you ever written down your life history for your family?
No, they know it pretty much. But a couple things I'd like to comment on. One is, it sounds to me like the Tsar never did figure out being ready for war, because I understand he lost the war in 1917. Is that right?
1917 was the revolution. Yeah. This war was over in 1905, and actually it was Teddy Roosevelt who negotiated the truce between Japan and Russia, for which he became the first American to win the Nobel Peace Prize.
So,
Yeah.
so your grandfather was actually in the U.S. when the revolution happened.
Yes. Yeah. I think he got to the US probably sometime around 1911. I know it was shortly before World War I, because he was worried about being drafted again, and then they would find out he had never actually been mustered out of the army. I looked up on the Ellis Island records when he came to the US, and I could find the records for his brothers, but not for him. And then at one of the talks I gave, somebody said, a lot of people traveled to the US, in this time on the visas of people who had died while waiting for the visas to come through. And that would have made sense, considering that he was wanted both in Europe and in Asia, that he would have traveled under someone else's name. So I can't find exactly when he arrived.
Well, my grandfather on my father's side, the way I hear it is he went to the store one day and never came back. And then the other one, which is more related to your story, he was sent on his way when he was 12 years old. Go out and work on your own. That was it.
And where was that?
In the U.S.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's strange that when my grandfather and his brothers came to the U.S., they settled in Shenandoah, Pennsylvania. I actually still have one cousin who lives in that area, and I couldn't figure out why. apparently Shenandoah was a Polish mining town. So
Mm.
they went there because at least there would be one language they could speak.
That makes sense.
Mhm.
But I hadn't heard of anyone else going, to Shenandoah.
Yeah.
In fact, they stayed there. My grandfather and the family stayed there until the Depression. My grandfather was running what do you call it? Kind of a general store. And he stayed there, selling food to people. Even once they could no longer pay for it, he just gave away all of the supplies they had until, there was nothing left. And my mother told us that one day after World War II, someone tracked them down in the Bronx at that point and thanked my grandfather for keeping his family alive during that time when they could not afford to buy food.
Mm.